Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're treating a 25-year-old ecological cold case exactly like a detective story. We're going to unmask the true and honestly completely unexpected culprit behind a massive global river invasion. It's a wild mystery that baffled some of the top scientists in the world, and it completely forced us to rethink how human activity actually alters the natural world.
So let's just dive right into this massive paradox. Now, if you know anything at all about aquatic biology, you know that algal blooms are basically synonymous with pollution, right? Normally, when you see a river just choked with thick, slimy algae, it's almost always because the water is highly polluted with way too many nutrients, usually from things like agricultural runoff or wastewater. But the mystery we're looking at today, it completely flipped that script. Scientists started finding these massive, devastating algal blooms in some of the most perfectly clear, pristine, nutrient-poor rivers on the entire planet. Biologically speaking, that makes absolutely zero sense. It literally shouldn't have been possible.
To really understand the stakes here, we first need to meet our primary suspect. This is a microscopic, single-celled alga. Specifically, it's a native diatom known scientifically as Didymosphenia geminata, or just Didymo for short. But, to anyone who's actually had the absolute misfortune of wading through a river infected by this stuff, it's widely known as, well, brace yourself, rock snot. Yeah, pretty gross. Under normal conditions, Didymo is just another harmless native cell quietly hanging out in the ecosystem. But under some mysterious circumstances, it completely transforms. It starts pumping out these massive extracellular stalks, creating these incredibly thick brown mats that just spread out and smother miles and miles of riverbed.
Let's trace the timeline of this whole mystery, starting with some incredibly bizarre sightings up in British Columbia. Back in the late 1980s, government officials were doing these routine water quality checks on Vancouver Island, and they started noticing this weird, patchy, slimy material covering rocks in perfectly pristine rivers. By 1989, several kilometers were completely covered in these heavy mats. This was absolutely unprecedented. Fast forward to 1993, and the blooms were so incredibly persistent that they actually had to form an ad hoc group of scientists just to investigate it. For years, it kind of remained this localized enigma. But then, in 2004, the mystery just exploded into a full-blown international crisis. Didymo unexpectedly showed up on the South Island of New Zealand, which is way outside its native range, and it just began blooming aggressively. The invasion had officially gone global.
Now, early on, investigators were totally desperate for answers, and they chased down two major false leads. Suspect number one was ultraviolet radiation. In the 90s, the thinning global ozone layer was a massive concern, and the working hypothesis was that increased UV radiation hitting these clear, shallow streams was somehow giving an unfair advantage to stock-producing diatoms because they might be more UV resistant. Okay, then we had suspect number two, which we can call the fisherman's boot. Because Didymo had so suddenly popped up all the way down in New Zealand, the running theory was that careless anglers, using those porous felt-soled waders, were accidentally picking up a mutated, highly invasive variant of the algae and basically just tracking it from river to river across the entire globe.
But as it turns out, the UV radiation suspect was completely and utterly debunked. And an absolutely ingenious 70-day experiment on Vancouver Island back in 1995 proved it. Scientists actually manipulated the environment to expose the stream to both the presence and the absence of UV light. And the data from that test showed that UV radiation had absolutely no consistent effect on the abundance of Didymo compared to other diatoms. Sunlight was definitely not the trigger here. So, cross suspect number one off the list.
With the UV theory dead in the water, scientists had to go back and really reevaluate that fisherman's boot hypothesis. Now, yes, humans can and absolutely do transport invasive species all the time, but here's the catch. In places like Vancouver Island, Didymo was already a native species. It had literally been living there for over a century. The evidence linking fishermen to the actual cause of the blooms was really just based on coincidental timing. A spike in fishing tourism happened to hit right around the exact same time the blooms started. But that doesn't actually explain the biological mechanism. The scientists realized they were missing the real link. What precise environmental trigger was turning a harmless native cell that had always been there into a massive, choking monster of a bloom?
To crack this case wide open, a brilliant collaborative team of scientists from Canada and New Zealand decided to run a proper, no-nonsense interrogation of this algae. They built this incredible custom riverside flume apparatus right there on the bank of the Waitaki River in New Zealand. This setup was honestly genius. They placed it right at the confluence of a river plagued by Didymo and a spring-fed creek that was entirely free of it. The real breakthrough here, the real game changer, was that these flumes finally gave them incredibly tight, precise control over a wild environment. They could actively dictate the water chemistry, the nutrient levels, the light, all over a long period. They were finally going to force this algae to reveal exactly what it took.
And boy, did it deliver. The team eventually published their findings in 3 landmark papers, systematically solving the whole mystery step by step. First, they measured the frequency of dividing cells to track growth, and they discovered it was incredibly limited by phosphorus. Second, they made this shocking observation. When the algae is starved of nutrients, it diverts almost all its energy into massive stock production. And third, the absolute smoking gun, they found the exact threshold. When the concentration of soluble reactive phosphorus in the water drops below a ridiculously microscopic 2 parts per billion, massive blooms are practically guaranteed.
Let's take a closer look at that smoking gun data. The findings show that as ambient phosphorus goes up, the algae behaves totally normally, and dividing cells increase, just like you'd expect. But when phosphorus drops below that tiny 2 parts per billion threshold we just talked about, the cells completely stop dividing. Instead, they shift into maximum overdrive, pumping out these excessive extracellular stalks. Basically, the lower the phosphorus drops, the thicker the mats of rock snot on the riverbed.
Now, what is absolutely wild about all of this is that the answer was actually sitting right there in an old email the entire time. Way back in 1994, the original task force in British Columbia reached out to this renowned diatom expert named Gene Stormer. In an absolutely stunning piece of scientific foreshadowing, Stormer replied, saying that a Didymo problem probably means that your water quality is getting better. He pointed out it's an ultra-oligotrophic organism, meaning it thrives in environments completely starved of nutrients. He basically guessed over a full decade before it was proven in the flumes that the water was actually becoming quote-unquote too clean when it came to phosphorus. Mind-blowing, right?
So the crucial point we have to understand is this really magnificent, totally counterintuitive paradox. When you have high phosphorus, which, remember, we normally associate with pollution and terrible algal blooms, Didymo simply divides rapidly, forms really small, manageable colonies, and then eventually dissipates. No harmful blooms occur whatsoever. But when you have an environment with virtually zero phosphorus, Didymo completely panics. It shifts all its biological machinery into frantic, excessive stock production, and that's what gives us these massive, choking mats. Didymo blooms don't happen in spite of low phosphorus, they happen directly because of it.
If you're kind of struggling to visualize why a microscopic organism would expend so much energy building such a massive structure, think of it this way. Imagine you are literally starving, and there's a single apple way up high in a tall tree. Your absolute best chance of survival is to use whatever energy you have left to build a giant ladder, to reach up out of your immediate surroundings and grab that apple. For the algae, the riverbed boundary layer is totally stripped of nutrients, so that giant ladder is the Didymo stalk, and the apple? That's the tiny, incredibly scarce bits of phosphorus flowing freely up higher in the water column. It's this bizarre, desperate survival mechanism that unfortunately ends up suffocating the entire river.
Okay, so we figured out the mechanism. We know exactly how the weapon works. It's extreme phosphorus starvation. But rivers on Vancouver Island and really across the globe haven't always been covered in Didymo. So who or what is suddenly draining all these pristine rivers of this vital nutrient? Why are they starving right now?
Well, get ready for the final plot twist, because the ultimate culprit is us. It turns out human activities are unintentionally driving this massive landscape-scale process called oligotrophication. We are quite literally starving our own rivers of phosphorus. How? Well, by burning fossil fuels and expanding agriculture, we are dumping massive amounts of airborne nitrogen onto the land. And when forests get fertilized with all this extra nitrogen, the trees in the soil suddenly kick into gear and suck up every single drop of phosphorus they can find, meaning practically none of it runs off into the rivers anymore. Add in climate change shifting our snowmelts and the truly tragic depletion of wild salmon populations, which, by the way, used to drag millions of tons of ocean-derived phosphorus back up into the rivers to decay, and you've got a perfect recipe for aquatic starvation.
So there you have it. We have officially solved the great Didymo mystery. It is not some mutant invader, it's just a desperate native species reacting to an environment we've accidentally starved of nutrients. But that leaves us with a truly provocative final thought to carry with you. If our massive, unseen alterations to the environment, changes that technically make our river water appear more pristine and crystal clear by stripping out nutrients, if that can unintentionally trigger a devastating biological takeover, do we truly understand the delicate balance of nature? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what's beneath the surface.